Sometimes, like in the higher or lower game example we saw earlier, we need to repeat a piece of Python code over and over again, either a fixed number of times or until a condition is met. In Python, this is called a loop. The simplest kind of loop is a loop which repeats a piece of code a fixed number of times. In Python, we usually do that with what's called a for loop. So here's an example of the simplest kind of for loop you can write in Python. If you begin a line of code for I in range 10, and then a colon, then Python will repeat the indented code following that for line for each value of I between 0 and 9. The fact that it goes from 0 to 9 is a little bit of a quirk of the range function, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the important thing there is that after your line beginning with the word for, you have to indent the code by 4 spaces as usual, so that Python knows what is part of the loop and what is not part of the loop. So the specific behavior of a for loop like this is that you give it an index variable, that's the I in our example here, and Python will execute the indented code first with I equals 0, and then with I equals 1, and so on, up to I equals 9. The indented code is called the body of the loop, and the variable I is called either a loop variable or an index variable. So before we see an example of this, a word about the range function. So in my example there, range 10 produces the numbers between 0 and 9 inclusive. In general, range n produces the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, up to n minus 1, and range AB produces the numbers a plus 1, a plus 2, up to b minus 1. Let's see a really simple example of a Python for loop then. Please ignore the NB tutor thing at the top there. That's just going to cause a little bit of a graphic illustration of what's going on to be printed as this loop executes. So on line 3 of this code cell, we have the beginning of a for loop for I in range 5. That means that the indented code following that for line, so in our case this is just line number 4, you can have more lines inside the body of your for loop if you want, but here is just one line. And what it will do is print out the value of I. So what we're expecting here to happen is that when I equals 0, we'll print 0, when I equals 1, we'll print 1, and so on, up to I equals 4, and then the loop will stop. Python would then continue with any code that comes after the body of the for loop. In this case, there isn't anything. Let's run this and see what happens. So I'm using the notebook tutor to explain what's going on. You can see there is a red arrow here pointing at the next line to be executed. Ignore the words global frame, but what I'm going to do is click the next button to step through this loop. This is a teaching tool. It won't happen when you write your own for loops. So first of all, I gets the value 0. You can see here the variable I is pointing to the value 0. The next line to be executed is indicated by the red arrow. That's to print the value of I. So when we execute that next line, you can see that 0 gets printed. Next, once we've finished executing the body once, we go back to the top of the for loop, and I gets the next value, in this case 1. You can see now that I has been redefined to take the value 1. And the next line to be executed is the print function. And the value 1 is printed. And this continues. Next I takes the value 2. 2 is printed. Next it takes the value 3. And a 3 is printed. Finally it takes the value 4. A 4 is printed. And at this stage the for loop stops. Python continues with any code that comes after the body of the for loop. In our case there's no code after the body of the for loop, so it just stops. Let's look at an example from mathematics where the natural way to express it in Python would be via a for loop. And that's the example of computing a summation, a piece of sigma notation. So suppose you wanted to find the sum from I equals 0 up to 10 of I squared. And imagine you were going to do this by hand. Well, probably the way you would do it is by keeping a running total s, which is initially equal to 0, and then adding on 0 squared, then adding on 1 squared to s, then adding on 2 squared to s, all the way up to adding on 10 squared. And at the end, your variable s would hold the sum from I equals 0 to 10 of I squared. So another way to phrase that would be to say that you want to run the same add I squared to s instruction for each value of I between 0 and 10. Well, that's precisely the kind of thing that a for loop is good at. So the easiest way to do this kind of thing in Python would be to use a for loop. Let's see that in action. So here's a piece of code that begins on line 1 with defining our running total s to be 0. And then we'd like to add up from I equals 0 to 10, I squared. We'd like to add each of those things to s. So on line 2, we introduce the for loop, which is going to do this. And you'll see we have to use for I in range 11, because range 10 will produce the numbers between 0 and 9. If you want the numbers between 0 and 10, you have to use range 11. That's just a quirk of the Python range function. So inside the body of the for loop, what we want to do is simply increase our running total s by I squared. And that will be done for I equals 0, I equals 1, up to I equals 10. At the end of that, s will have the value, which is the sum from I equals 0 to 10 of I squared. And you can see on line 4, this time we have something after the body of the for loop. So once the for loop is finished, Python will run line 4, which just prints out the value of the variable s. So in general, inside a Jupyter Notebook code cell, Python will print the value of whatever statement is on the last line. So here, the value of our running total s after the for loop is finished executing. Let's run this, and you can see we get the answer 385. That's the correct sum from I equals 0 to 10 of I squared. So far, the only for loops we've seen used the range command to run through a set of consecutive integers. But for loops are much more general than this in Python. You can use a for loop to do something for each value of a variable inside all kinds of structures, in particular lists. So we're going to learn about lists later, but for now, the way you write a list in Python is by using square brackets. So in the code cell I'm indicating here, the list which we're going to iterate over is the list containing the numbers 2, 4 and 6. When you use a for loop with the syntax for x in and then a list, what Python will do is run the body of the for loop with x equals 2, and then with x equals 4, and then with x equals 6. So it will assign each element of the list in turn to the index variable x, and then execute the body of the loop with that value of x. So here what we should expect to happen when we run this code cell is it will print out the 3 elements of that list, which is exactly what happens. So the range command is actually much more flexible than we've seen so far. We saw the version of range n, which produced the numbers between 0 and n-1, and we saw a 2-variable version of range, where range AB produced all the numbers between a and b-1. But there is in fact a 3-variable version of range. So if you call range with 3 arguments, start, stop and step, then it will produce an arithmetic progression beginning with start and with common ratio step. So the numbers it will produce are start, and then start plus step, and then start plus 2 times step, all the way up to the smallest number in the sequence, which is less than the final value of stop. So here, for j in range 1, 12, 2, we'll produce an arithmetic progression beginning at 1 with common difference 2. In other words, it will print 1, 1 plus 2, which is 3, 1 plus 2 times 2, which is 5, all the way up to the last value in the arithmetic progression before it gets to 12. So in our case, that will be 11. Let's run this, and you can see that we get the odd numbers starting at 1 and ending at the last odd number less than 12, which is 11. If you want to produce numbers in a descending order, you can use range with a negative step. For example, if we look at our last range command here, where we have range 10, 0, 1, that will start with the value 10, and it will subtract 1 each time. So we'll get 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and it will stop before it gets to 0. So the final value will be the step before it would hit 0, which is 1. So when I run this, you'll see we really do get the integers 10 down to 1. If you want to see the documentation for range, the official Python documentation is linked at the bottom of this notebook. You can download the notebook from our Moodle page. If I just click that, you'll see it takes us to the Python web page, which has documentation about all of the built-in functions and methods in Python. And here is a detailed explanation of absolutely everything you can do with the range command. These Python documentation tends to be quite technical, particularly if you're a beginner. It can be quite hard to understand because there's lots of technical things about the gory details of Python in there. But if you really want to know the most detailed possible information about range or any other Python command, this is where to find it. You'll see the link in our notebook. And here's the page. We're on the Python 3.9.1 documentation.